genocide, of the Islamization of Europe, and have really tried to offer this grievance-fueled narrative that at least seems to be resonating with supporters and new recruits. Um, I want to kind of talk about this in terms of countering violent extremism and CVE, which, from my purview, the last 20 years of the global war on terrorism, that's always meant jihadis, right? Even when it was occurring in other kind of realms, to me, what I saw, the lion's share meant how are we going to deal with this threat of, primarily Sunni-inspired terrorism. Now we're left with, racially and ethnically motivated violence. Uh, in terms of CVE, are we prepared to deal with current and future REMV threats? And can we get better at anticipating threats before they metastasize? Mary Beth, I'd like to start with you on that.
So, in terms of anticipating threats before they metastasize, I think we tend to be, as you mentioned, Colin, we tend to be reactive rather than proactive. So I think a lot of that is driven as researchers and potentially maybe CVE practitioners. I think a lot of that is driven by funding, by media demand for commentary on certain things. So I think if researchers could think a little bit more independently about not where we are now, but what's on the horizon, drawing on theory. So for me, when I'm trying to make sense of the world, I find going back to those good old theories of terrorism studies, so like Martha Crenshaw, Paul Wilkinson, I find that those things are actually much more helpful than granular analysis. So obviously you need empirical evidence, but that's sort of where I see, or just the time. I know certain government agencies do provide the time to think about these sort of long-term trends and threats, and I think it's absolutely critical, to be focused or to have the time and the resources to focus on those things so we don't miss them. In terms of cultural loss, I know Amar is going to speak a little bit about that, but I think when I look at cultural loss and the rise of REMV, we do see it as this sort of, as I mentioned earlier, this backlash to globalization, to the loss of, white privilege in society. But I also see cultural loss when I look at other terrorist groups or violent extremist groups. So I'm absolutely not an expert on the Middle East. If anyone is, please correct me. But my understanding there, right, is that we did have that the rise of Islamism was this backlash to secularism, right? This idea of cultural loss in the region, Western intervention. When I look at groups in Northern Ireland, so loyalist paramilitaries, there wasn't so much about cultural loss, but the loss of one's privileged status within the political system, which is what I think we see a lot of REMV or far-right terrorism embodying. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, you covered a lot of ground there, and I think you're right to absolutely pull in outside groups, right? Groups in the Middle East, groups in Europe, because I've noticed maybe in the last year as there's been more of a focus on REMV, REMT. Again, different terms depending on what government agency you talk to, what part of the world you end up operating in. But for Amar, and this will be my last question before we open from the audience, I want to focus on the E in REMV, which is ethnic, right? Can you talk to us about what the majority with a minority complex is and what the consequences are? And I believe we've seen this most poignantly throughout parts of Asia. So Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and elsewhere. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, going back to what Mary Beth was saying, I mean, this is largely a response, particularly in the current period, to globalization and kind of a transnational awareness of what's happening abroad, right? And so it feeds into a lot of the propaganda in a lot of these countries. And it has to be said, anti-Muslim propaganda specifically, that feeds into a lot of these countries, that kind of arises from what Stanley Tambaya, with a focus on Sri Lanka, called the majority with the minority complex. It's this idea that even though you're the majority in the country, you're the ethnic, religious, cultural majority in the country, there's something about your place in that majority, your place in that society, that is turning that identity, which should be fairly comfortable, into an embattled one, right? This sense that you have a minority complex, that you always feel like you have to continuously stake your claim as the majority. You have to pass policies that are majoritarian. that you have to keep minorities under your thumb, that minorities, particularly Muslims in a lot of these countries that we're talking about, are this kind of sinister fifth column who are secretly plotting to take over, secretly plotting to become the majority, secretly plotting attacks against the majority. And so this fuels a lot of these policies that we're seeing, you know, the Hindutva movement in India, the treatment of Uyghurs in China, the treatment of the Tamil community and the Muslim community in Sri Lanka, the treatment of the Rohingya in Myanmar, and a lot of the kind of white nationalist arguments, as well as you mentioned, white genocide, this kind of sense of white civil rights that popped up a bit in the U.S. Under Charlottesville and so on. This idea that, you know, we're the in-group, a kind of increased attachment to the in-group. The in-group is being eroded, and that we need to do something to rejuvenate, make people proud of that identity, and then fight back against whatever threat they seem to be pointing to. And so a lot of the, if you look at a lot of the propaganda across these kind of diverse countries, it's remarkably similar, right? And there was some, a lot of this circulated on Facebook and Twitter a while back with respect to India and Sri Lanka and Myanmar in particular, that Muslims are, you know, are plotting to have a lot of children, that they're using sterilization tactics against the majority to keep that population down, that they're plotting attacks and so on. And so the propaganda, bizarrely, from Myanmar, Sri Lanka, China, India, Western Europe, actually talked about very similar things throughout. And so this is why I think that this sense of kind of in-group identity being eroded when we're talking about future threats is going to be with us for some time, because it's getting much more heightened in the contemporary world than I was expecting, let's say.
It's a great answer, and it actually goes a long way toward answering the first question we had from the chat, which is, how do far-right movements in the West compare with other far-right movements, such as the anti-Muslim rhetoric we've seen in India and China? So I think you touched upon that directly, and I think, you know, a good amount of that comes back to this propaganda around the demographic time bomb, right? Warning people that, you know, they are now shifting into this other reality where they no longer enjoy the rights of a majority. And that it's quite damning for a lot of people. The next
common, sorry, and the kind of common thread between the kind of golden age and the utopian future, you know, is quite common throughout, regardless of these cases as well. So that's something to watch for.
And in your sense, is there a lot of hyperbole that surrounds that, or a lot of kind of revisionist history pointing to a greater time that maybe wasn't that great to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, I think as all nationalist movements do, they pick and choose from history the things that they want to be part of their movement, right? And so they kind of whitewash a lot of the nuance and a lot of the diversity and a lot of the complexity that existed in the past for the sake of kind of making a very nationalist argument in the present. And so this golden age of the past that probably didn't exist and is supposed to set you up for this utopian future that you're probably never going to get to. But it animates a lot of activity, political and violent activity in the contemporary world.
It also strikes me as, you know, what you just described. It reminds me of what was going on in the Balkans, right, in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, right? A kind of whitewashing of papering over some of the positive aspects of living together in multi-ethnic communities, and only focusing on the negative aspects. And you know, some politicians and military leaders reaching way back into the past to find examples where they could, you know, sell to their supporters that their you know, other ethnic groups were in fact the enemy. I'd like to move on. I have a question for, I think for Mary Beth, and someone from the audience asks, what are examples of effective methods to destigmatize former fighters as they are reintegrated back into their communities of origin?
Great. So in terms of the methods, I don't, you know, with very few exceptions, I don't think any of them have been rigorously and empirically tested. So that's something where we need more research, but I can say what has been done in the DDR context. And so some of the things that have been at least shown at least qualitatively to be effective is preparing communities. So preparing communities that these individuals will return, either through messaging, through discussion groups, and also just spreading information within the community. So like take ISIS for an example, just spreading information that, not all of these individuals joined willingly. Some of them were coerced, explaining the motivations for their involvement. They're not all horrible people, that those sorts of things can increase communal acceptance. Shared projects, which I mentioned earlier, seem to be especially pivotal in doing that. And individuals sometimes don't even need to reveal that they were a former member. Usually that happens over time, but it embodies this commitment to a shared future, and helps develop those pro-social relationships.
Great. I'd like to stay on this topic because the next question, and it doesn't specify exactly, but my sense is that this question maybe grew out of some of the information we know in the aftermath of the attack in Vienna. And the question is, for both of you, how do we better balance the need to protect the public from those who've quote unquote faked their way through de-radicalization, and the need to reintegrate those who've truly given up extremist ideology? Amar, we'll start with you and then we'll move to Mary.
Yeah, that's a very, very difficult question and kind of an ongoing policy debate, I think, for that links up to repatriation as well, is that are these people choosing to go through these programs, or are they kind of mandated to go through these programs, and what does that mean on the other side? I do think this goes back to something I wrote about a long time ago on kind of the different kinds of people that are coming back, right? And I think Colin and I wrote a piece on this as well, that not everybody is going to be trained and dispatched to come back to the West to kind of launch attacks. There's going to be a kind of other cohort of people who I think we called disengaged but not disillusioned, who are, for a variety of reasons. The
Atlantic piece.
Yeah, a variety of reasons disengaged from the movement, whether it's battle fatigue or they had a family or whatever it might be. But of all the ones that I've interviewed and who've come back from Syria, if you ask them a question like, if there's another, foreign fighter mobilization in a couple of years, what would you do? And they'll say, I'll be on the next plane out, right? So they're still kind of attached to this broader social movement, but for very particular reasons, they've been disengaged from the current conflict. And so I think figuring out a way to disaggregate and deal with some of those questions might be an answer, but it is, it's an impossible question in many ways, because it's like asking people to read minds, right? And I don't envy law enforcement and a lot of these NGOs who are working in the prevention space and the disengagement space, that have to navigate people who are probably outright lying in order to kind of just make it through the program and then do whatever they have to do. But I think it's an impossible question, but I think it's one that a lot of people are struggling with.
Well, I think you've given us some good ways to at least kind of start piecing an answer together. Mary Beth?
Yeah, sure. So I think sort of based on my own research, I think it's important to remember that for most people, de-radicalization is a very long process. In my experience, it's years, maybe even a decade. So I think, expecting someone to come out of a 6-month or a 1-year program completely de-radicalized is, not going to be the norm. So some individuals may, and I think it's also important to note that some individuals who are in that program may not be even radical to begin with, right? Maybe their involvement was motivated by friendship, and they may spew the ideology, but they might not actually be motivated or believe in that ideology. So I think those are two important things to remember. So if we do have individuals, you'll never know if someone's faking, right? You can say whatever you want. So there's no way to actually know whether someone is, without, obviously there's certain intelligence methods you could use to see what else they're doing. But I think one of the things you can do is you just focus on promoting their disengagement, right? So promoting, even if you have these ideas or you have these grievances, and I know some programs are doing this in Europe, how do you channel those non-violently, right? So if you're upset about what Assad's doing to children in Syria, can you channel that into, into protest activity, nonviolent protest? So those are some of the things that I think you can do, and you can create these protective factors, right, through the development of those pro-social ties within the community, right, through employment, through social groups, And those pro-social ties serve as protective factors. And they also, they change people's calculus in terms of the alternatives they have available to them. And then over time, over those years, they help erode the ideology. They change the ideology in a more organic way than the government having you, sit down with an imam or something. I don't think that that's going to be pivotal. And then the other thing I would say is that I do think that, the programming has to be adequately resourced. So again, because it is this sort of long-term process, I think that individuals should be checked in on, in terms of, from a social safety net as well as a security net. And I think a lot of times these programs, 6 months, 1 year, they're just very under-resourced. Most of the money goes into sort of hard CT measures.
If I can just add one more thing on that, I think one thing to keep in mind is how we define radicalization, right? Because I think what we expect, at least from some of the social media conversations I've seen, is that if some of these guys come back, particularly the women, and they continue to wear the niqab, or the men come back and continue to be kind of moderate Salafi in outlook, we still call them radicals, right? and so there's this assumption that to be truly safe, to be truly coded as de-radicalized, you have to become this like liberal Democrat who goes clubbing every weekend. And that's probably not going to happen with a lot of these guys. They're going to come back and continue to be religious, continue to be conservative in a lot of their outlook. And so understanding, as Mary Beth said, they might be channeling a lot of their grievances in pro-social ways, but expecting them to look a certain way and act a certain way, and coding that in your mind or interpreting that in your mind as what derad looks like is going to be a problem, because they're not going to probably fit that mold that you're looking for. And this was true from a lot of the women, some of the women that I interviewed in Syria, is they're not, ISIS in the camps wasn't telling them to wear a niqab. They're wearing the niqab because they're religious. And so when they come back to Toronto or wherever, people are going to look at them a little suspiciously. Oh, you joined ISIS and you're still wearing a niqab in Toronto. How are you still radical, etc. And so that's going to be, I think, a conversation we have to have more honestly than we're having now. Is what are our kind of pre-existing assumptions about what a de-radicalized person looks like? And this is true in the white nationalist space too. I mean, some of the formers that I've interviewed in the white nationalist space have just gone from kind of white supremacist to white civil rights, right? And they've just kind of taken a step down. They're not out there preaching multiculturalism and diversity and pluralism. They've just taken it down a notch. And so what does that mean, right? Are they still committed to the movement? And so I think these are difficult kind of transitions people are making. And as Mary Beth says, they take decades sometimes to work this out for themselves. And some of these agencies and organizations that are trained to help them work it out are funded for a year or two. And so, after that funding runs out, these people are on their own. Then that also builds grievances as well, because they'll come back and say that, I've been abandoned, I'm unemployed. And so this is I think having a much more mature conversation about what that looks like is important. But sorry for taking over.
No, I think what this kind of back and forth has reminded me of is really maybe we take for granted the field of radicalization and de-radicalization. We're still in the nascent stages of attempting to understand these concepts, even though there's great research out there. I mean, if you look at some of John Horgan's work, J.M. Berger's work on extremism, I think we don't fully really, I think a lot of people don't understand differences between de-radicalization and disengagement, right? And Julie Chernov's done great work on disengagement of Indonesian jihadists. So, and then lastly, in talking to scholars like Bart Skerman, who is looking at why some people radicalize but actually never go on to commit acts of violence. Sometimes we treat those things synonymously, right? We say this person is radicalized, and we assume that means that they've either committed or intend to commit acts of terrorism, and that's not always the case. I don't know what the data says, but I'll be curious to see Bart's work once that starts coming out. So there's a lot there, I think, that we don't really understand, even though as scholars we've been working on these issues for some time, and then what differences exist between jihadis and the far right, or other forms of violent extremism. I want to ask about, we've got a question in the, from the audience here that asks about, has psychology or behavioral science been at the apex of CVE programs? And I think, you know, from where I sit, for a while, the CVE almost looked like a cottage industry, right? People were coming up with all sorts of cockamamie, you know, proposals. It seemed like there was a lot of money in the space, so you had people kind of coming out of the woodworks, claiming to be experts. And then you had, you know, fairly ridiculous things like the Saudi art therapy program, you know, where you have these guys draw a couple of pictures of their feelings and are released back into society, and we wonder why those things don't work. Can you talk a little bit about the psychology and behavioral science that goes into thinking about CVE programming? Let's start with Mary Beth, and then we'll go to.
Yeah, so again, just from my, you know, brief knowledge working with practitioners, my sense is that some of them, I mean, the ones who reach out are really interested in having an evidence-based approach to this. And so they are consulting psychologists and behavioral scientists, you know, to try and inform their policy and programming. But I think you sort of hit the nail on the head, Colin, that there is a lot of CVE programming that is not informed by sound social science. It became kind of a cottage industry. And I think we saw a lot of development programming being rebranded as CVE just to secure funding. So, and I will say that those programs that do try to take a sound social science approach and consult with academics and researchers, often what we would recommend to them is just not feasible financially. So what I've seen is, you know, here's what we would recommend, but you know, we don't have the money for, you know, 2 years of cognitive behavioral therapy for 64,000. You know, so so there are clear limits on the financial capacity of governments or NGOs to implement some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't work in the CVE space that in that capacity, so I'm not too sure. But from my interviews with community members, I can say something kind of what Mary Beth touched on is that I think the CVE framing, the securitization framing, does have massive impact and negatively in communities, right? And so even in Canada, we had not so much anymore, but in the past we had several instances where, because of funding, if you were a after-school mentorship program or if you were just running a basketball camp, your funding was very likely to be cut. But if you reframed what you were doing as not just basketball for you know, disadvantaged youth, but basketball for de-radicalization or basketball for prevention, all of a sudden the money came, right? And what that did was it did two things. One, it turned a lot of everyday kind of community organizations into kind of security organizations, right? Or security-oriented organizations. And that had a lot of impact on the youth that were coming as well, because now they weren't just playing basketball because they were children, but they were playing basketball to make sure they weren't becoming a security threat. And that kind of was obvious to them, and that had an impact on how they saw themselves as kind of the state only cares about my well-being if I'm either troubled or troublesome, right? And so it wasn't that the state and everybody was concerned about me as a young person in their country, but it was more so, how do we make sure that they don't do anything from a security perspective? And so I think how we frame CVE in that way can have a lot of second and third order consequences, I guess, if we want to go back to that term, almost by accident if we're not careful.
Great. Yeah, I think a lot there that I've observed as well. We are wrapping up on time, so I will save the easiest question for last. And if you guys could just give you know, very brief thoughts here. What in your mind is the biggest lesson that we've learned in the last 20 years of you know, having these conferences, working in this space? Or maybe not the biggest lesson, but what would you want if you could impart, you know, one concept with people as they leave this webinar today, as they leave this forum? What should they remember about violent extremism? Whether it's kind of correcting conventional wisdom, dispelling a myth, what's the level takeaway? We'll start with Amar and then Mary Beth.
Sure. I mean, the main thing I think that is still a kind of common assumption is that these people, it's how we used to talk about criminals back in the 50s, right? That they're kind of these unique individuals out there in the world. They have horns. If you can just kind of figure it out or sequester them from society, everything will be fine. And I think not so much in the scholarly community, but in the public, I think that's still an ongoing assumption that terrorists or radicals are of a particular sort. And I still get questions from community members and journalists and others about what is the kind of risk factors, what are the vulnerabilities, how can we kind of pick out people who are vulnerable. And when you tell them, there is no, the usual talking point, there is no common pathway, there is no typical pathway, everyone comes at this differently, everyone has different push factors, pull factors are also quite different. It's not a satisfying answer to most of these people, so they kind of often revert back to their stereotypes, and that I think is an ongoing challenge of a lot of academics who work in this field to have this conversation with the public, because what the consequences of that is of course a lot of anti-Muslim policy, a lot of surveillance, a lot of interference in the community, a lot of monitoring of mosques, which used to happen a lot in Canada and that I know particularly well, because you would have one individual from a mosque leave to go to Syria, and law enforcement would come in and basically interview every single person in that community, which was massively harmful. And goes back to what Mary Beth was saying earlier, is that if this individual comes back, we need that community to reintegrate this person. But what you've done as law enforcement by interviewing and securitizing the entire community is you've made them say, no, keep him as far away as possible, because we don't want that smoke, right? We don't want people knocking on our door. We don't want my kids monitored. We don't want our kids followed by law enforcement because they've made friends with this guy. And so I think getting rid of some of those assumptions that these are somehow, crazy people, but they're actually just one of us, and treating them in that way and understanding the policy questions in that way, I think is the biggest lesson, but it's also not the lesson that's been learned. So.
Very well said. Really well said. Mary Beth?
Sure. I agree completely with Amar, but I will add, I guess for me, it's that these tactical victories that we've had in the war on terrorism are short-lived. So going back to what I said earlier, if we fail to plan for what comes after, and I think where we see widespread violent extremism, I'm not talking about, the isolated Ted Kaczynski, or where we just have, smaller groups, but where we see widespread violent extremism and endemic violent extremism, I think we need to sort of step back from this focus, as Amar mentioned, on individuals, right? And it's not to absolve them of their wrongdoing, but say that, there's something wrong here, right? This is, there's a great article by Luigi Benante, all the way back to 1979 in the Journal of Peace Research. And he says that terrorism is a symptom of a failing political system, right? There's something wrong in the equilibrium or the status quo in this political system that needs to be addressed. And so I think we need to think about violent extremism and terrorism as a political problem that requires political solutions. So there has been a clear shift to focus on military strategy and less focus on political strategy and diplomacy. And so I think that diplomacy is going to help us in the long run. Those are the things that are going to help, resolve the problems that are contributing to violent extremism.
Well, I hope you're right. And I would just like to take this opportunity to thank both of our panelists, as well as our audience and everybody at Resolve for really what was a dynamic forum. And I think, I certainly took away quite a bit. I've got a couple of pages of notes here, and I hope you did too. So let me turn it back over to Alistair Reid, and he'll close us out.
Thank you very much, Colin, Mary Beth, and Amar, for a really engaging and fascinating discussion. I'm sure it'll give us plenty of food for thought in the coming days. And I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope that you enjoyed the part 1 of the 2020 Resolve Network Global Forum series, and we'll be reaching out to you via email and Twitter with a quick follow-up survey. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us and for sharing your feedback with us. Please stay connected and check back for the upcoming events in the 2020 Resolve Forum series. Our next event will be co-hosted with the International Center for Counterterrorism, The Hague, on December 1st, focusing on past, present, and future trends in right-wing extremism, featuring Liz Pearson, J.M. Berger, and Donald Holbrook. Thank you again to the US Institute of Peace, to the Program on Violent Extremism, our partners in the US government, and all members of the Resolve Network who make this event possible. Stay in touch on our website at resolvenet.org and our Twitter at resolvenet, where you can find all of our publications and upcoming events. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.